The next item on the order paper is an opposition motion on public sector pay. I will ask the clerk to read the motion.
That this Assembly recognises the immense burden placed on public sector workers by the political uncertainty and the failure to deliver equitable pay awards, resolves that all outstanding public sector pay negotiations for 2023 to 2024 will be concluded by the end of this financial year, and calls on the Minister of Finance to make a statement to the Assembly upon the conclusion of these negotiations or at the end of the financial year.
Thank you. I now call Daniel McCrossan to move the motion.
Moved.
And thank you. The Business Committee has agreed to allow up to 1 hour 30 minutes for this debate. The proposer of the motion will have 10 minutes to propose and 10 minutes to wind. All other speakers will have 5 minutes. Please open the debate on the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see no more critical issue than this one for this House. Over the last number of weeks and months, and indeed years, colleagues across this House will have stood in picket lines with our public sector workers, our nurses, our doctors, our healthcare workers, our teachers, classroom assistants, teaching and non-teaching staff, people who are the lifeblood of our community and our society, that keep the clock ticking on a daily basis, people that educate our children, people that save our loved ones' lives and care for those who need them most. Where were they in the last number of weeks and months, standing in the freezing cold, demanding their fair pay that they truly deserved? Where were we, Mr. Deputy Speaker? We weren't in this House, that is a certainty. But this is an issue that has gone on far too long. When public sector workers were needed, they were there. Throughout COVID and some of the biggest challenges that our society has faced, they were there. When they needed us, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we weren't where we should have been. This House was collapsed on 2 separate occasions, one for 3 years, as well noted earlier, and again for 2 years. All along, we could have been here helping to resolve the challenges that are faced by our nurses and midwives and healthcare workers. In the last number of weeks, on the 18th of January, Mr. Deputy Speaker, those people stood on picket lines in the largest strike action that this place has seen for 50 years. That's an unforgivable situation. And I heard, whilst I stood on those picket lines, executive parties tell public sector workers that when we're back in there, we're going to resolve this problem. We hear you. It's time, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that they put the money where their mouths are and ensured that our public sector workers receive the pay that they're duly entitled to. The truth is that over recent years, particularly since the Conservatives came into power in 2010, the overall real average pay has fallen by a significant percentage for public sector workers. And indeed here, in more recent years, particularly in the period between 2021 and 22, we've seen an average fall of 4% in public sector pay and a further 7% between 22 and 23. Pay has fallen sharply for public sector workers in Northern Ireland over the past number of years, with a combination of high inflation, storming budget crisis, and the truth, a lack of devolved government, because the people that needed us to speak up for them were left without a voice because we weren't here where we should have been. Hard-working teachers who have been in classrooms over COVID at high risk, who we relied on to look after and educate our children, they too have stood on picket lines. And indeed, a significant gap has opened up with teacher pay compared to other parts of the UK. Newly qualified teachers in England earn about £30,000 per year compared to £24,000 in Northern Ireland. You know, we hear a lot about borders and concern about the border in the Irish Sea, but there's no discussion or debate about the financial border that exists between people across the United Kingdom. Because the truth is, when you look at England or Scotland or Wales, our teachers and nurses are all much better paid than they are here in Northern Ireland. So let's talk about economic borders, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because I don't hear the same standoff when it comes to ensuring that people are duly paid for the job that they are doing. The hypocrisy on this matter is absolutely outstanding, and the truth is that teachers and doctors and nurses, classroom assistants aren't buying it. They aren't buying it because they don't see the same level of concern when it comes to their wages. Teachers' pay has dropped by a staggering 25% in the past decade, causing recruitment issues, retention issues, resulting in continued shortage of teachers. And also when it comes to substitute teachers, they've been treated appallingly in this place. They're not paid for the job that they do appropriately. That has led to huge issues in attracting substitute teachers. The Executive must act and offer a fair pay settlement for those responsible for providing an outstanding education for our children and young people. Teachers' pay has absolutely stagnated. The cost of living has continued to rise, leaving many teachers struggling to cope. A couple of teachers recently said that they can no longer afford to teach. How is that for a damning indictment? Some others relying on food banks. This is a huge crisis which needs to be resolved. We're now back here nearly a month. Conversations are ongoing, but not quickly enough. We need to resolve this issue so that we can settle the industrial disputes in schools to ensure minimal disruption to children's education. The continued devaluation of the teaching profession cannot be tolerated and must be challenged in the strongest terms. Teachers continue to express their frustration, and they continue united in their determination to get what is rightfully theirs. The one clear message that I had, Mr. Deputy Speaker, from my time on the picket line standing shoulder to shoulder with the people that I represent, is that they did not want to be there. They do the job that they do because they love teaching. They love helping people. They love caring for those in our community. Those nurses, those doctors, those classroom assistants and teachers, those people that keep our society going on a daily basis were forced onto that picket line because they were making choices about heating their homes or feeding their families, and at the same time continuing to do an outstanding job in supporting our people. They feel undervalued. They feel that what they do on a daily basis is not appreciated. If we can't stand up for our public sector workers, what is the point? It sends a message to wider society and employers that if this is how government treat public sector workers, then it's okay for other employers to do the same. When are we going to send a message from this House that we must pay people appropriately and fairly for the job that they do? This whole public debate, this debate about public sector pay, it's almost talked as though it's a pay increase. It's hardly even levelling up. In truth, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we don't pay our public sector workers enough. Instead, we'd rather do acts of random appreciation by clapping them on. But when it comes to paying them, we're not there. Yes, I'll give way.
Just on that very point about the clapping, as we know, during the worst excesses of COVID, our health service workers were at the coalface. They were there and they were helping save people's lives. Would the member agree that many of those people now are emotionally fatigued, mentally fatigued as a result of that, and they deserve more, much, much more than claps?
Absolutely. I completely agree. It's actually, in hindsight, it's embarrassing that politicians in this House were clapping on at those health workers, but when it came to actually delivering for them, they've been let down. And that is the message for this House. Public sector workers have been continually and consistently let down by this House. In 2024, our public sector workers shouldn't have to worry about whether they will have enough money to cover their bills. Every single person in this chamber has been cared for or has a loved one that has been cared for by our NHS staff, particularly over recent times. Last year, our healthcare workers received below inflation pay offers. It's time that those in power in this executive delivered for those workers. Even if the restoration of pay parity with England on pay bands was to be introduced, that still leaves Northern Ireland health workers in third place behind Scotland and Wales. We need to be ambitious for our public sector workers. We need to demand more for them. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, if this House doesn't start realising the importance of our public sector workers, the value of our public sector workers, and we continue to let them down, the crisis that this place now faces in terms of healthcare and in education will worsen. We need to show our public sector workers that they're valued, and today we need to send a message to the Executive that it's time to pay up, pay our public sector workers, and let them get on with the job that they love doing. Thank you.
I thank the member and call Declan Kearney.
Alias Cion Cordia agus be Sinn Féin ag tacu leis an rún seo. Ní mór gach féidireacht agus ardan a glacu chun an éisteacht agus na hachhaní a bhalú is teachn san áit seo ar leas a phobal. Agus lena choisian tá mallart slí de. Mr. Speaker, last week I said that an effect of Tory policy here in the north was to turn this region into an economic backwater. And the crisis in public sector pay, which we are discussing this afternoon, is a direct product of that. 14 years of Tory austerity from London here in the north is not just a political choice and a political decision. The imposition of austerity here reflects a policy mindset towards the north and all of our people, all sections of our community. English politicians have never cared about the priorities of working families here, or indeed wider society. I would contend that for the rest of this mandate, there needs to be a step change embraced right across the chamber, within our political institutions with regard to workers' pay, workers' rights, and the sustainable investment that is required to maintain good, proper public services. And, Mr. Speaker, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, because there has been a pathway set out for us to address those issues in NDNA in 2020. So, I am suggesting that there are two key steps which need to be taken. Firstly, we need to see an implementation of social dialogue. Social dialogue with our trade union movement and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, with this Assembly, with our ministers, and with the political structures of this institution. Secondly, we need to see increased investment and a new funding model secured for the North, linked to the maximum transfer of fiscal powers from London. And that, Mr. Speaker, is not a job for the Finance Minister alone. So instead, I would suggest we require, across party, all of society and the whole of government solidarity, which campaigns for and secures the kind of economic and financial stability which is required for everyone in this region. The challenge which we face in meeting that scale of vision and ambition will be to deliver on proper power sharing in these institutions, to deliver on the full implementation of the Good Friday Agreement, and then, Mr. Speaker, mar ucal scoir, to show the political leadership that is in fact required for all parties, for all politicians in our society, for all ministers, to be progressive and to work for all.
Thank you. And I call Diane Forsyth.
Mr. Deputy Speaker. Public sector workers deserve fair pay in return for the vital contribution that they make to delivering essential frontline services across our province. And this includes all groups of public sector workers, with none left behind. Public sector workers also deserve honesty as to what can be afforded and delivered at this point in time. And we should not be in the business of misleading people on this. and to imply a commitment that all public sector pay negotiations would be concluded by the end of this month should not be taken to lead people to believe we're in the position to settle all awards in this time. The letter from Laura Trott, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, to Dr Takiva Archibald, the Northern Ireland Finance Minister, on the 13th of February, offered an additional £846 million to meet needs in 23-24, with £584 million of this for public sector pay. Local decisions have increased this, which is most welcome, but the Finance Minister has made it clear that this is not enough to settle all public sector pay negotiations, and some entire groups of workers are not included in this figure. It's important again to be clear on this point. The obstacle to delivering fair pay awards has not been political uncertainty, as this motion suggests, or indeed a lack of political will, but rather the fact that public services have been underfunded by the Treasury for a number of years. Baseline funding in Northern Ireland is simply not sufficient to meet our needs. As public sector pay is a key component of departmental spend, and our public sector workforce is disproportionately larger than elsewhere in the UK, it's perhaps the most visible symptom of allocating funding in Northern Ireland on the basis of a population share rather than on need. All of this creates challenges for recruitment and retention of people working across our public services. In some cases, this is due to higher wages in the private sector or other countries, and in the health service, many can attain better pay and more flexible work when they are employed by an agency. In a context where £584 million has been made available by the Treasury to meet public sector pay negotiations for 23-24, it is right that the public sector pay negotiations, where possible, should be concluded by the end of the financial year, and that the Minister of Finance should make a statement to the Assembly upon the conclusion of these negotiations. But again, we must be clear that we know that this will not cover all public sector pay negotiations. We also need to be clear that the money awarded by the Treasury for 23-24 is a one-off. It does not inform the baseline going forward, so that while it might be possible to claim that we've retrospectively been funded to need in 23-24, the £846 million does not address the deficit in baseline funding arising from our having been underfunded in 22-23 and 23-24 going forward. The Laura Trott letter makes provision for an additional £520 million for the financial years 24-25 and 25-26. If all of the monies allocated for public service stabilisation in these years are spent on public sector wages, and nothing from the stabilisation pot on the public services themselves, there will be a £60 million wages shortfall in both years, and from 26-27 there will be no money available to meet this £584 million public sector pay shortfall, as funding to Northern Ireland plunges but below need for the second time in the space of 4 years. In this context, while it would be possible to use this debate to simply note that £584 million has been made available and agree negotiations for 23-24 should be concluded this financial year, and that the Minister of Finance should make a statement to the Assembly, this debate also affords an opportunity to demonstrate that the DUP is doing more than looking at the immediate future, and has taken the lead in developing creative ideas to find sustainable, longer-term funding solutions. We continue to be committed to making sure that Northern Ireland is funded to need. The UK Government must afford Northern Ireland the same two protections it currently provides Wales to prevent the block funding falling below need: a 5% uplift to slow down the impact of the Barnett squeeze, and a fiscal floor at the Hotham definition of need, below which funding cannot fall. Our staff in health, education and across the public sector in Northern Ireland deserve to be treated the same as their counterparts across the United Kingdom. And let us be clear, it was the DUP that fought hard for any increase in funding for Northern Ireland and continues in that fight.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And one of the most shameful outworkings of successive periods of suspension of this House in recent years has been the degradation of public sector pay for some of our most essential workers. Take our nurses as just one example. In December 2019, the Royal College of Nursing was forced to commence strike action for the first time in its 103-year history. With the arrival of New Decade, New Approach and the restoration of these institutions just 1 month later, it was promised that never again would our nurses be forced onto picket lines. Not 4 years later, following yet another collapse, our nurses watched as pay awards were made in other parts of these islands, whilst they received nothing and once again became the worst paid in the UK. Backed into a corner by our politicians, those workers who we applauded during the pandemic were left with no other option but to protest over pay parity and unsafe staffing levels. And I would remind members that those nurses sacrificed pay in order to engage in that strike action. That is a stark contrast to those from this House who were on strike from their roles for 18 months and received a healthy salary. Those same MLAs who were animated about the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Windsor Framework and the academic arguments about the IRC made barely a whimper when it came to the very real sea border which they created for pay, conditions and living standards for some of our most essential workers. It is welcome that this Assembly and Executive has now been restored and progress on pay is being made. But speaking to those on picket lines last year or earlier this year, it is clear that this is about so much more than simply pay.
Never give way.
Of course.
Okay. Would the member also agree with me that in addition to the damage done in the last 2 years, that going back to 2019, when I was diagnosed with cancer and nurses went on strike, both my treatment and the treatment of many other people with very serious illnesses and diseases in Northern Ireland were shamefully treated, not by the nurses, but by a House that failed to sit and a House that failed to deliver?
I could not agree with the member more, and I know that the member has personal experience in that regard as well. We in this House are asking health workers to operate under extreme pressure in unimaginable conditions. The numbers speak for themselves. Over 8,600 patients waited more than the recommended 12 hours in A&E in the months to December 2023. Almost 342,000 people are on a waiting list for their first consultant-led appointment, and that is against a backdrop of almost 6,000 vacancies across the health and social care system. And I feel like I am participating in this debate in a parallel universe, given the vote that has just happened. Because whilst I agree with members that Tory austerity has had an impact, whilst I agree that underfunding has had an impact, it seems that the DUP and Sinn Féin are blind to the fact that one of the biggest impacts on our health service and on public sector pay has been stop-start government. And it is well and good for Mr Kearney to talk about working for all. But Mr Kearney seems very happy with a position whereby voters for the Alliance Party, for People Before Profit and indeed for the Green Party are treated as second-class citizens in this House. Platitudes are one thing, but delivery in this chamber is quite another. And I think members, particularly on the Sinn Féin benches, have a brass neck, frankly, given how they voted on the previous motion, to decry a lack of stability in public finances and public services. It was the now First Minister who published the Bingo report in October 2016. A matter of months later, in January 2017, Sinn Féin pulled the institutions down. We had government for a matter of months during a global pandemic when no transformation was possible, and then the DUP decided it was time to walk out. So whilst the photo ops are all well and good, whilst we can talk about parties working together, what our public sector workers, what our public services need and demand is a promise of stability. Stability that can only be delivered through reform of these institutions. The degradation of pay and conditions for our health workers have been replicated right across our public sector. Transport workers, teachers, classroom assistants and so many others have been impacted. I am conscious too that our junior doctors have action planned and also that our classroom assistants and other non-teaching staff are awaiting their long-promised pay and grading review. I accept that pay and grading review has languished with the Department of Education and Department of Finance when there have not been ministers. But I do sincerely hope that now we have ministers in place, we will be able to make progress on that issue. We are in a better place, Mr Speaker, but if we are to sustain the progress which has been delivered over recent days and weeks, parties in this chamber need to be honest with the public who demand reform of these institutions about their position and grasp the opportunity to ensure these institutions endure into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Alan Chambers.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. A lot has already been said in this chamber and on the airwaves over recent weeks about the issue of public sector pay. As such, today's debate will likely be a replication of much of that. Thankfully, in recent days and weeks, there has been real progress made in resolving many of the public sector pay disputes, with many unions currently consulting their memberships on the respective offers on the table. I hope that very soon they will begin to be accepted. But whilst we await the outcome of these processes, it goes without saying that the almost 2-year absence of this place from February 2022 to February this year inflicted real damage. No public service escaped unscathed, and amongst the people who were most greatly impacted were so many of our public sector workers. It has been the long-standing position of my party that given our medical staff in Northern Ireland are signed up to the wider UK terms and conditions for the NHS, when the independent pay review body recommends a percentage increase, it should be implemented. No ifs, no buts. It's a simple matter of fairness. And yet, regardless of whether individual pay awards are based on the recommendation of pay review bodies or through the internal deliberations of the individual sponsor departments, as we all came to see, very little was possible in the absence of an executive. In particular, it was an absolute travesty that once again our health workers felt that they were left in the position of having no choice but to undertake industrial action. It is simply not in the DNA of our valued HSC staff to cause any disruption to those they serve. We all remember what happened in late 2019 and early 2020, a time with what were then wholly unprecedented scenes of widespread industrial action. And equally, we remember how, after the restoration of the executive in January of that year, Robin Swan secured political anonymity around the executive table to not only immediately restore pay parity, but to maintain it. And for a while it appeared as if things were going well. Pay awards were being honoured, and indeed, when finances permitted, our health workers were even awarded additional in-year uplifts over and above what some colleagues elsewhere were receiving. And then, barely 2 years after that last restoration, the executive once again collapsed and public services were pushed to the brink. And what made it significantly worse, Mr. Deputy Speaker, was that the collapse in February 2022 came about only weeks before that executive and this Assembly should have been agreeing a budget with future allocations. But instead of departments having financial certainty and the scope to deliver upon even the most important of the independent pay review recommendations, the ability to really decide on anything was literally robbed from them. I appreciate there may be a difference of opinion as to the rights and wrongs of holding the people of Northern Ireland to political ransom, but I'm categorically in the group that thinks the pain and the disruption inflicted was far too high a price to pay. The animosity felt by our public sector workers had boiled over into record levels of action, and whilst pay for many has now thankfully since been resolved, the implications of the disruption will be long felt for quite some time yet. And that's particularly in the case of the health service, where it's not just cancelled consultations or procedures, but the loss of so much precious capacity with so few appointments even booked. Finally, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would conclude my remarks with an appeal to those workforces who are still holding out for revised pay awards, and in particular, following my focus on health, I would make an appeal to our junior doctors to think again about their actions later this week. The Health Minister has already said that he has instructed his officials to deliver the DDRB recommendations, and for junior doctors that's an average increase of over 9% in pay, with first-year doctors receiving a consolidated increase closer to 11%. And whilst I know some are sticking by their ask of 35%, we just need to be realistic. There's not an unlimited pool of money, and all ministers have had to live within the funding realities of what has been made available. There is no doubt that political uncertainty has had a damaging impact on our public services. But instead of further action, now is the time to try to repair the immeasurable damage that uncertainty has inflicted. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker.
I call Liz Kimmins.
And I can safely say, given the previous speakers, that there's no one in this chamber who would disagree that our public sector workers should get the pay increase that they well and truly deserve. As others have said, we have witnessed, particularly in recent years during COVID, that it was our frontline public sector workers who stepped up to the mark and delivered, when the vast majority of other workers had the opportunity or the option to work from home and adapt their working pattern to deal with the public health crisis we were facing. Our healthcare workers kept our health service running. And as been referenced already, we came out and clapped for those workers every week. Yet when it came to giving them what they're entitled to, the Tory government showed that they felt claps were a sufficient reward for the hard work and dedication of these workers. But it is disappointing that the proposers of this motion have allowed the Tories to abdicate the responsibility to fund this place in line with the needs of our people by failing to acknowledge the role that they play in preventing us, from properly investing in our public services, particularly our health service. Something that the SDLP joined with the rest of the parties in this Assembly just 4 weeks ago in passing a cross-party motion calling on the British Government to properly fund public services here and to place public finances on a sustainable footing. 13 years of Tory austerity has decimated our public services, no matter what way you package that, including pay for health and social care workers. A shameful indictment of just how high on their list of priorities the Tories place those individuals working in the most challenging environments, in deteriorating conditions, which is driving health and social care workers away from the jobs they love in their hometowns and cities, driving them to the south of Ireland, across the water and in many cases to the other side of the world. This continued trajectory is undoubtedly the fundamental issue of the huge crises we are witnessing across every corner of our health service. And if we do not have the adequate finances to pay our health and social care workers a fair wage, not just now but in the future, and ensure they are working in conditions that are properly resourced, then this constant firefighting to deal with colossal waiting lists, a lack of respite provision, delayed cancer diagnosis and treatments, amongst a long list of serious issues our health service is facing, will not be resolved. Mr Deputy Speaker, in recent days I met with the Junior Doctors Committee, who will take to the picket lines this week as a result of 30% pay erosion over the last 16 years. Yet we ask ourselves, why are GP practices collapsing around us, and why can we not access our GPs? If we do not look after our public sector workers, we will have no workforce, and no workforce means no public services. Sinead. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I am happy to support this motion today, but I would also urge the opposition not to get lost in their efforts to grab a headline, but instead join with the rest of us and focus our collective efforts in securing a financial package from the British Treasury that is reflective of the needs of the people of the North and will deliver a long-term sustainable footing for our health service and all our public sector workers.
Call Paul Frew.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm really enjoying this opposition day, Mr Deputy Speaker, because of a number of reasons. One, I really like the idea of an opposition, and I do believe that this place has been lacking because we didn't have an opposition. So I really like the idea of having an opposition and having opposition days, because I think that with regards to the process of democracy, it's only right that the executive members are held to account. Another reason why I like the fact that the SDLP are in opposition is because, quite frankly, they were woeful in government. And let's hope that they can do better in opposition. And I was just looking earlier on in my room, Mr Speaker, in this camera here. It's brilliant because you're all sitting in your place, and the one camera can get you all in shot at the one time, and that's really, really effective looking, although you have a member away at the minute. So I wish the SDLP all the best in the opposition. And I'm glad that the second motion that they bring... Yes, I will. Yeah.
I thank the member for giving way. I do, however, take some exception with his description of SDLP's performance when in government as woeful. Could he perhaps highlight any example of this woefulness that would compare with the loss of over £600 million of taxpayers' money, like that of the RHI presided over by the DUP?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Of course, interventions are meant to be short, but yes, I can. And again, it's disappointing to know that the SDLP have only been in opposition a matter of months, and there's already more cracks showing in the SDLP than the car lifts in our MOT centres, which you failed to address at the last run-in, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And hypocrisy is astounding from the party that was prepared to sack nurses. The party who is in opposition was prepared to sack nurses if they didn't adhere to a mandate. That's the sort of party that's now in opposition, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad then that they're not now in government. But I'm glad and I welcome the fact that the second motion they've brought forward here is about this issue on public sector pay, because it's fundamentally about people. And because of the size of our public sector, it's enormous. It's an enormous burden on this place to fund it, but we must also recognise that within that massive monster of a public sector, it's people. And it's people who function and help our people every day. So it's important that we recognise that, and it's important that these people, the people who work on our behalf in our government departments and our frontline services, are paid respectably and paid what they deserve. And that hasn't been the case, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I'm glad that most of the executive ministers who are now in post see this as the #1 priority, because it's about people. And it won't function without paying those people the correct remuneration. But the truth is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in that the money that has been allocated with regards to the one-off, the $584 million, just won't cut it. Because it really is looking backwards with regards to the 23-24 year. But what about next year? What about the recurring costs? And the year after that? And the year after that? So it's important that we make sure that we get the funding we require. And it is true to say that Barnett just doesn't cut it anymore, and that there now has to be a better measurement of need, and that we should look towards Wales as to how they're getting on and make sure that we get sufficient pay and funding for the need that we need in Northern Ireland. And of course, our public sector is bigger than both Wales and Scotland, so it's inevitable that we will probably require more, especially in the short term, to counter that issue with regards to our public sector size. I've also heard it here today say about fiscal powers, and this scares me, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because I do not believe that this Assembly, or this Executive more to the point, has the maturity to have more fiscal powers. And what you're basically saying at this stage is this. You're basically saying that we want to give public sector pay and public sector workers pay in this hand, but then you want to take it off them in this hand. And not only that, well, in a wee minute, once I make progress, and not only that, you want to burden the private sector also, where I grew up in construction. You're basically going to burden them with further fiscal taxes and rate rises and everything else that goes with it, with more fiscal powers. I will give way.
My colleague in the Finance Committee, would he say that one reason why he thinks we're not mature enough to have more fiscal powers? I disagree, but is one reason why we wouldn't be mature enough that certain parties in this Assembly keep collapsing the institutions and completely deny basic political and institutional stability?
Yeah, and the party in the opposition has used this as a mantra since they've been back, and I get why they're doing it, but it really doesn't. It's not really constructive, as they say they are, to keep raising this issue when we are, and every single one of the parties that's in the executive is looking forward. And so you're nearly creating a goal. You're creating a goal that's not actually there. So I would ask, I would ask, and I will end on this, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I value the work of an opposition, and I wish you all the best, and I really do hope you are effective. Thank you.
Call David Honeyford.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
I think echo the things that have been said across and start by acknowledging the tremendous dedication and hard work that has been exhibited by our public sector workers, especially amongst the last 7 years when 5 of those this Assembly hasn't sat. But I come to this debate as our Alliance Party spokesperson for economy and support the motion. Our economy to grow needs a strong, vibrant public services, and unfortunately the damage done to our public services and the image of this part of this island for inward investment and the lack of stability in this place has hemorrhaged confidence for those looking in. Recently I've asked both Ministers for Economy and Communities about reform for Invest NI and for Sport NI, respectively. Those departments have a checkered recent past, and while raising the reform issue there, I've made it clear that in both cases we do have some really talented individuals working in those bodies. But unfortunately it isn't them that are causing the problems. It's the complete lack of leadership, direction and focus, and the responsibility of that starts in this chamber. Life for everyone in society has challenges. Life isn't a straightforward path. It takes direction, and there's always a turn and a twist, but it takes energy to keep moving forward. And if I can use an analogy of an escalator in one of our shopping centres, all aspects of life can feel like walking up the down escalator. But when parties here have walked away and collapsed this place, everything here in this Assembly stops. But when you stop on the escalator that's going down, and you think that you're standing still and pausing these institutions, because in reality, life everywhere else goes on, you automatically move backwards. And when you eventually try to start up again, you start from further back, while the rest of the world has moved on. And that is true of our public sector workers and of their pay. But also, really importantly, and I think this point needs to be stressed, it's actually their working conditions and the pressure that they also are put under and they have to work in, and the services that they are expected to deliver. Because fundamentally, this is about making our public sector workers feel valued. When parties here have chosen to take their ball and walk off the pitch, there are consequences far more reaching, and that financial cost is currently being paid by our public sector workers. I come from business, and in business, your employees are your first customers. So after all, it's them. If they can't be positive about the business they work in, why should anybody else be? And this applies for government departments too. Our workers, our public sector workers, are the first customers. If you want first-class public services, you need to show those providing those services that they are valued. It's obvious, and yet incredibly, that we seem to think pay can be regarded as an afterthought. The cost of the Assembly suspension felt this year and every year as the gap grows between other regions of the UK. It's been already said about nurses and everywhere else, between here in the UK and the massive difference now emerging between here and the south. Suspension can never happen again. And I echo the comments of my colleague, Owen Tennyson, about Sinn Féin just voting against that reform and preventing this from happening again. It's the Alliance Party that has consistently led calls for structural reform, and we continually lead in that debate, and genuinely we are thankful to the SDLP for joining in with us on that, and we welcome that move, that we can work together in that direction. This House must also ensure the suspensions of this Assembly, and let's be honest, it's been happening since 1998, that we collectively do all we can to reform these institutions, to bring them up to date on the reality of life in Northern Ireland in 2024. We do acknowledge the tremendous dedication and hard work exhibited by our public sector workers, and we urge the Minister of Finance to make a statement to the Assembly once these negotiations have concluded, or by the end of the financial year. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that public sector workers receive equitable pay they deserve, and we must act with urgency to make that a reality. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. Call Cara Hunter.
Mr Deputy Speaker. Our public sector workers are the very backbone of this place. Our society could not and would not function without them. They're the very tapestry of our society. Our nurses, bus drivers, junior doctors, teachers and more are the threads that hold us together. Yet in the face of a relentless cost of living crisis, they are being stretched to their limits. With inflation rates soaring, the value of wages has plummeted, leaving many unable to afford the basics of life. Our healthcare staff, who are the front line and saving lives, find themselves struggling to pay bills. Bus drivers who ensure our mobility and connectivity are forced to make hard choices between heating and eating. Junior doctors, as rightfully talked about earlier, have had no choice other than to go on strike. Again, the very backbone of our healthcare system, who work exhaustive hours only to face financial instability. Our teachers, tasked with shaping the future of our children and young people, are being undervalued financially, questioning their ability to continue in their vocation, as are our important classroom assistants. And recently I had attended the picket line outside Rossmar Special School in Limavady and spoke with classroom assistants there who had detailed they're working 2 or 3 jobs at a time due to the level of financial stress that they're experiencing. And when we see the level of care that they provide in that role, it's just crazy to think that they have to do that. So we must see an uplift in their pay. That's why this place must honour them and deliver equitable pay awards and resolve all outstanding public sector pay negotiations. That's why the SDLP has put the motion to the floor today. The financial pressure facing our workers has had a toll on their mental health. Recent studies have shown an uptick in anxiety, depression and stress among all public sector workers directly correlated with financial pressures. And I think that's the key thing when we talk about the need for pay increase today is pressure. Our public sector workers are under significant stress. The pressure is crippling and it's crushing people. And this brings me to my next point, which is the sheer lack of simple pleasures, once considered mundane, a family outing, a small vacation, or even a simple dinner out, have become luxuries in the eyes of so many and something that they simply cannot afford. And recently I was speaking with a constituent who said, after a tough work week, you used to be able to go down to the pub and have a pint and kind of talk it over with your friends, and that was it. But now even going for a pint doesn't fit into their budget. That's the level of financial stress that we're seeing. But this isn't just about economics. It really is about those simple things, the quality of life, the mental well-being of our constituents, our workers, who shouldn't be living to work, but working to live so they can have a high quality of life for themselves and their family. And articles published over the last 2 years really paint a grim picture of where we are in this situation in Northern Ireland. For instance, a recent piece highlighted that over 60% of our nurses in Northern Ireland are considering leaving the profession. And I'm a daughter of a nurse, so I've seen over the decades just the level of stress, the hours that they're on their feet. We had a previous nurse here in our chamber, and I've talked about that before, just the level of stress our nurses are under and the long hours that they do. And they deserve their pay just for the job that they do. They're incredible. And they can't afford to live on their current wages. Another report pointed out the alarming rate at which our bus drivers are leaving jobs, leading to reduced services and impacting daily lives for thousands of citizens. And I know in my own constituency, we're such a rural constituency, so our bus routes are vitally important. But these aren't isolated incidents, they're symptoms of a broader crisis. Fair pay in this context isn't just a demand, it's a necessity. And it's about acknowledging the fundamental role that these workers play in all of our lives and all of our communities, and ensuring that they can live with dignity and fair pay. It's about recognising a society that undervalues its public sector workers is a society at risk of losing them, which would lead to an unimaginable impact on our daily lives and for future generations here in the north of Ireland. As we stand at this crossroad, the question before us is not whether we can afford to increase public pay for our public sector workers, but the question is, can we afford not to? The implications of inaction are far-reaching, affecting not just the workers and their families, but the very fabric of our society here in the north. We must represent the needs of workers within these 4 walls, and we cannot see another shameful collapse of these institutions again. It's all interwoven, it's all interlinked. Let's not kid ourselves. It's time to invest in those who invest in us. It's time to recognise their worth with more than just an applause. Let's come together to ensure that our nurses, our bus drivers, our junior doctors and teachers and more can live with the dignity they deserve, reflecting the invaluable service that they provide to us all, and let's give them the pay that they so rightfully deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. I call Stuart Dixon.
Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak today on this very important matter. an important matter that is one that has been for a very long time a priority for the Alliance Party. That is the pay of our public sector workers. Perhaps I should at the outset declare an interest in having been a public sector worker for all of my working life. Prior to coming to this Assembly nearly 12 years ago, I had the unique opportunity to work in the public sector and to look at public sector pay and conditions. Over 30 years working as an employment relations officer in the Labour Relations Agency, assisting public sector and other trade unions to negotiate their pay and conditions. I welcome the long overdue work now being done by ministers and government departments and trade union negotiators across the public sector in determining and delivering pay increases now. However, these negotiations must go hand in hand with long-term fiscal guarantees and mechanisms to ensure that we can adequately fund our public services and implement the necessary transformations. Public sector workers are not looking for special treatment. They're merely seeking fairness and equality in pay and conditions, and their funding must reflect this. Funding that has been delivered to their counterparts in England and Wales, but due to, as others have reminded us here in this debate, successive failure by Sinn Féin and the DUP, denying stability and certainty to many cases underpaid and undervalued public sector workers. One really does wonder how speakers in this debate today believe public sector workers can take them seriously. It is this stop-start failure that has led to the absence of proper long-term planning. Strained budgets have led to cuts and overspending. Our services have deteriorated more than in any previous period of collapse, falling far short of public expectations, damaging the resilience of public sector workers. It is evident the accumulation of longer-term issues that have been neglected for far too long. The current one-year package, which broadly speaking allows us to achieve pay parity with the rest of the United Kingdom, falls short of addressing the systemic pressures on public sector pay going forward. Ultimately, without a long-term sustainable option, the recurring costs of these pay awards will put continued significant pressure, if not impossible pressure, on the Executive's finances, forcing him into a predicament where they must choose between cutting services or ensuring fair pay. But these are not the only challenges that Northern Ireland faces. Improvements are needed in areas like healthcare, waiting lists, school budgets, infrastructure, childcare, poverty alleviation, climate change, mitigation, and much, much more. All of this would be difficult enough for a well-functioning government, let alone one that struggles with stability, unity, and strategic focus. In the face of these pressures, we cannot have more of the same. Without genuine change, how is government going to work? Northern Ireland has little chance of addressing its problems, not least of given the scale of challenges it now faces over the next 3 years. That, with the dying days, hopefully, of a Tory administration and the uncertain days of a new government. These changes can only happen if Northern Ireland has sustained stable government, and to do that, reform of our institutions is needed. Furthermore, the repeated cycles of what can only be described as the ransom politics have not only pushed the government structures to breaking point, but have also eroded public confidence in the very concept of devolution. If we are to safeguard the future of the Good Friday Agreement and our institutions, then it is imperative that we implement significant changes in these structures. The reform proposals by my party, which respect the fundamental principles of the agreement, offer a pathway to stability and fairness. These reforms must ensure that no single party can stop the formation of a government or single-handedly collapse it in the future. This approach protects the rights of parties to participate in government, but it also gives parties the option to opt out if they so choose, something the largest two parties cannot do under the current system. No party would be excluded, but equally no party would have a veto over the operation of government that denies others the right to do their job and deliver for our constituents and public sector workers. Even more, a long-term programme for government and multi-year budget are essential. They will set out agreed priorities for the next 3 years, maintaining sustained focus on improving public services so that benefits are tangible for the day-to-day lives of our citizens. While the financial packages agreed upon with the UK Government provides some relief for Northern Ireland's budget, it doesn't solve the systemic issues within our public finances.
Member, bring his remarks to a close.
I will. In conclusion, Mr Speaker, the time to reform is now, the time to defend our public sector workers and pay and conditions is now, and they should no longer be used as a political bargaining chip.
And I call Justin McNulty.
We need to do better than playing catch-up with our overburdened, underpaid public sector workers' pay packets. We need decisive action and ambition from this executive to ensure our public sector workers feel valued and are fairly rewarded. If we continue to delay fair pay for our teachers, our midwives, nurses, doctors, classroom assistants, physios, radiographers, dietitians, public transport workers, how can we be surprised when they vote with their feet and walk out, as they did on the 18th of January, when tens of thousands of hard-working, hard-toiling workers from 16 different unions walked out in a demonstration against unfair pay and against unjust pay? I have to applaud the unions for organising such an event of significance, the major event of the last 50 years, where there was such goodwill from everybody on the day. So well done to them on that. We need to pay public sector workers what they are worth and ensure they feel valued. For keeping the wheels of our economy turning, for keeping the wheels of our society turning. Pay them what they're worth. Fair pay now. Gurma Yogurt, Las Camcola.
Thank you. And I call Jerry Carroll.
I must say that this motion is absolutely typical of this Assembly across the Chamber, with parties of all shades who have cut public sector pay whilst in government, yet have no qualms talking about the burdens faced by public sector workers, real burdens though they are. Public sector workers who have had their living standards attacked don't want more crocodile tears, not least when Stormont at this minute is offering them another real terms pay cut. Deputy Speaker, words of concern from the establishment parties here, both in the executive and in the official opposition, are as useful to these workers as a chocolate fire card, because nothing less than a pay raise will even begin to address the pay erosion and enforced poverty that they've suffered at the hands of these very institutions. When public sector workers took strike action and demanded a pay raise, they did so with an eye to skyrocketing prices and rising inflation, which peaked at around 11%. I'm sure many public sector workers, Deputy Speaker, found it galling when Stormont ministers paraded their 5% deal in the media. 5% is not only a cut in real terms, but it doesn't even come close to restoring overall public sector pay levels, which have declined by at least 20% on Stormont's watch. People before profit were alone in opposing the Stormont budget bill on the basis that it copper fastened a real terms pay cut for public sector workers, and perhaps unsurprisingly, the motion here makes no mention of that real terms pay cut, and it puts no concurrent demand on the executive to give them a pay raise and to invest properly in our public services. This motion, Deputy Speaker, seems more concerned about the timing of a deal than with delivering a deal which gives workers a real pay raise, what they need above that 5%. So I would urge any public sector worker to be wary of demands and promises from parties that have been in an executive for the past 2 decades and played a part in pay erosion. Also, Deputy Speaker, I have a reminder for parties here who think they can quickly ram through a deal or pass a pay cut off as a pay raise. They may hold the purse strings for now, but the 170,000 public sector workers who took strike action in January have the real power here and across our society. If they choose to reject this pay cut, executive parties will have to cough up the money. It's time to pay these workers, it's time to pay them properly and invest properly in our public services like people were promised. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on the Minister of Finance to respond, and the Minister has up to 15 minutes.
And I want to thank those who have taken part in the debate today on public sector pay. Some members' comments I will respond to in the course of my remarks, and others I will address at the end. Our public sector workers are at the heart of service delivery. This executive is united on the need to resolve public sector pay. One of the first actions I took as Minister of Finance was to seek flexibility from the Treasury around the funding that was made available in the financial package to deal with the departmental overspends and public sector pay. Getting this flexibility meant that the amount that the Executive could allocate for pay was over £100 million more than was originally provided for in the financial package, some £688 million in total. I was really pleased that the Executive supported the proposal to allocate that amount towards public sector pay. It signals that we value our public sector workers. They are delivering public services in our communities on a daily basis, in our schools, our hospitals, across the transport network and right across the public sector, including our civil servants. It was important that we went as far as we could, and that's what we did as an Executive. This funding, along with the £380 million for departmental overspends, has now been provided as a total resource DEL allocation for each department. Gaining Executive agreement to these departmental allocations meant that departments could immediately begin to take forward negotiations to agree public sector pay awards for 23-24. And providing this allocation for pay as part of a broader funding envelope granted flexibility to departments to manage pay awards within the overall funding available. And as members will also be aware, I then brought forward a budget bill for 23-24, which gave departments the legal authority to spend the funding that the Executive had agreed to. You will know the urgency with which this had to be taken forward, and I am grateful for the support and cooperation I received enabling this legislation to be introduced at such pace. It was born out of necessity. I agree entirely that public sector workers have waited too long to get the pay rise that they are entitled to for 23-24. The fact that this delay has taken place in the context of a severe cost of living crisis and a squeeze on household budgets has only exacerbated the impact that we know so many of our citizens have felt. In terms of pay negotiations, the one that I am directly responsible for as Finance Minister is civil service pay. Upon taking office, I prioritised meeting civil service unions. These were among the first meetings I had in my first week as Finance Minister. I quickly gave officials a negotiating remit to engage with unions on the 2023-24 pay award. I asked for these discussions to conclude as quickly as possible to get the offer made, and I am pleased to advise negotiations started on the 19th of February and the pay offers were issued on the 26th of February. The civil service pay offer will see the majority of civil servants receive a 5% consolidated increase plus a one-off £1,500 non-consolidated payment. Some will also receive progression increments. I am also pleased to maintain the commitment to the civil service being a living wage foundation employer and will increase pay to match the most recent living wage foundation real living wage rate of £12 per hour. The lowest paid staff in the civil service currently earn £21,053 a year. By increasing pay in line with the living wage foundation rate, the annual pay will rise to £23,177. This represents a 10% increase. The pay offer I have made will, if accepted, see this 10% increase for the lowest paid staff backdated to August 2023. The eligible staff will also receive the further £1,500 non-consolidated payment. I understand the unions will ballot their members on this offer. I am pleased to note that NIPSA, the union with the biggest membership in the civil service, has recommended the offer to its members. I hope staff will look favourably on the offer and that unions' consultation with their members will proceed as swiftly as possible so we can get pay to staff as soon as practicable. For my part, I have done what I could as quickly as possible to make sure public sector workers receive the pay awards they are entitled to for 23-24. I know other ministers with responsibility for other groups of public sector workers are seeking to agree pay awards for this year as quickly as possible. My strong hope is that these negotiations will come to a conclusion as soon as possible so that the pay awards can be implemented as quickly as possible and provide some relief to public sector workers and their families. The motion asks that the Minister of Finance makes a statement to the Assembly upon the conclusion of the pay negotiations or at the end of the financial year. As I have said, I am not responsible for finalising pay negotiations for public sector staff groups except for civil service pay. It is right that we afford unions the time and space they need to ballot their members. In the case of civil servants, we are expecting non-industrial unions' consultation with members will be concluded by the middle of March, with industrial unions' consultation expected to take 8 weeks. I will update members once negotiations around civil service pay have been concluded. In terms of the other public sector staff groups involved in negotiations, it is for the relevant ministers involved to update members on these negotiations, as they will be closer to the details that relate to each of these. I know, for example, the Health Minister has made a written statement to the Assembly setting out the latest position with regards to health pay negotiations. I just want to address some of the comments that members have made in the course of the debate. Mr McCrossan, I just mentioned that point around giving unions their time and space. He mentioned that the negotiations weren't going quickly enough, and it is important that unions' processes are respected in that regard. And I know ministers and employers are trying to progress their end of negotiations as quickly as possible. Declan Kearney and Liz Kimmins both mentioned the impact of Tory austerity, which I agree was a political choice to run down public services across Britain and here. And I agree with Mr Kearney around the need for social dialogue going forward and for a new funding model. Diane Forsyth mentioned the need to settle disputes quickly, and that we weren't able to give departments everything that they want, and that was the case, but we did allocate as much as we were able to, and I'm glad that the Executive supported the proposition that was put forward. I agree with Alan Chambers, no workers, healthcare or other, want to be on picket lines and indeed suffer financial penalty for being there. Mr Frew, I don't agree with his assertions in relation to fiscal devolution, but I'm sure that we will debate that many times in the time ahead. Mr Hunniford and Cara Hunter and Stuart Dixon, Justin McNulty all mentioned the value of our public sector workers, needing to value them, needing them to have good quality of life and good working conditions as well as decent pay. And I think that's not as particularly pertinent in healthcare, where staff, when they're on strike, it's not just about pay, but it's also about safe staffing levels, and I think it is important that we progress that also. But public sector workers right across the public sector will be key to delivering the transformation that we all want to see, so it's important that they are properly recompensed. Last Concordia, as I have said, I want to see public sector pay awards for 23-24 made to staff as soon as possible. For my part, I think I have done what I could in the short space of time since the return of the institutions to make sure that this happens. We are not there yet, and more work remains to be done, and I know workers involved have waited a long time for the increases they are entitled to, so I will continue to do what I can to ensure negotiations are concluded and awards made as quickly as possible. Whilst we are discussing pay issues for this year, we will soon need to turn to public sector pay considerations for next year. I have had a constructive first meeting with the Treasury last week and look forward to continued engagement in the time ahead. I welcome the agreement of the Treasury to immediately commence work together on the development of a fiscal framework that reflects our level of need. This will be critical to delivering sustainably funded, high-quality public services, including on public sector pay.
Thank you, Minister, for that response. I now call on Colin McGrath to conclude and wind on the debate. Mr McGrath, you have up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to wind on this debate today. It is an important one for many people, and it shows the important role of an opposition for not just shouting from the sidelines or being opposed to the Executive for the sake of being opposed, but allowing us to highlight the issues that are of critical importance to people right across this place. But surely, after more than a decade of stop-go politics, it is time for change. Stop-go politics doesn't serve anyone's interests, and it does not deliver positive outcomes for the public. It has been effective in diminishing people's trust in politics. It has been effective in damaging public services, and it has been effective in delivering a decade of pay erosion for those in our public sector. Today's business is important, and it highlights the importance of having the opposition here in the Assembly, even though one member of this place took to Twitter last week referring to the opposition as an irrelevance. But, Deputy Speaker, it is time for that reform. The need for reform is evident so clearly on the matter of pay. Since 2010, our nurses have suffered a year-on-year real terms reduction in pay. So much so that an experienced nurse is being paid in real terms the same amount for 5 days of work now as they were for 4 days of work in 2010. A grade 5 nurse here could earn between £27,000 and £33,000. Meanwhile, in the south, they could earn between €33,000 and €50,000. And what about our doctors? In the south, their wage could range from €102,000 to €121,000, almost a third more than they get here. And just to set it into a specific context, while the amount we pay our healthcare staff has eroded over the last 10 years, the amount we expect them, as an example, to pay for a house has skyrocketed above the rate of inflation. In 2012, the average house was 3.7 times the top band 5 salary for a nurse. Now it's 5 times that salary. And let's think of our domiciliary carers, those heroes that are out and about in our community, being literally a lifeline for so many, but grossly underpaid. Forcing them to pay for their own petrol and at times equipment tells these key public sector workers that this and previous executives do not care about them. For them, we need to see public sector pay reform. Our teachers too, Deputy Speaker, working in classrooms right across this place, more often than not taking work home with them in the evenings, purchasing their own resources because of their passion to teach, to instil knowledge in our young people and forging leaders for the future. We even have principals that had to go out and buy toilet rolls for the school because the school budget had run out. For these public sector workers, we must see public sector pay reform. So whether it's the refuse collector or the consultant, the teacher or the cleaner, whatever public sector role you play, executive after executive and collapse after collapse, you have been let down by these institutions, and that needs to change. Yes.
Agree with me, lots of members, particularly Sinn Féin members, were right to call out Tory austerity and the impact on public sector workers here. But isn't there a contradiction between calling out Tory austerity, the impact it has on public sector workers, but then saying that you want to retain a veto which allows one party to collapse government and hand complete power to Tory ministers to do what they like with this place?
Absolutely. I mean, we hear time and time again that the Tories are the big bad beast, and yet for 5 of the 7 years, in the last 7 years, we've left them in charge. We've let them take the decisions. We've let them put their ideology on our public sector workers. And then what do? Complain that the Tories have done that. We are demanding that reform begins now. However, we're under no illusions that the reform we seek to make the good for the people of Northern Ireland has to be made here and not in London. Here we had just 1 month in to these institutions, we have had a party leader, an executive minister, saying that the Secretary of State, who is currently polishing his CV and having his P45 drawn up, that he needs to do the heavy lifting on reform. A Secretary of State who has proven himself to act against the wishes of people here with no understanding of what life here is like.
I thank the member for giving way. Surely the member recognises that reform of these institutions would require legislation at Westminster, and therefore it is imperative that there is an engagement between the UK Government, the Irish Government and all parties. And while I share scepticism about the current Secretary of State, there's a contradiction by saying this should happen urgently, but that we shouldn't engage with the current government.
Time and time again, people have said that it needs to be London that takes the decisions, and every time that you speak to London, they say it's up to the parties here to take the decisions. So I think we start by taking the decision here that we want to see that reform, and then hopefully that change will follow. It is time to put an end to failure. Addressing our public sector pay is inherently tied to the reform of these institutions. We cannot and we must not divorce poor public sector pay and the collapse of these institutions, and that is why we as the opposition have sequenced these motions today. And it has been noted, we saw already today who it was that has voted for the opportunity for reform here and who has voted against it. And I think it is worth noting that those that have voted against the reform are likely to be the ones that will be complaining in the future if there's any future collapse and the impact that it has on public sector pay. Because significant pay divergence, that's the opposite of the pay parity, has occurred when there was no executive here, but also, shamelessly, when there actually was an executive here. Our nurses, our doctors, our teachers, civil servants and others have been forced to work here for less, doing the same job as in other places, and that is totally unfair. To the public sector workers, the grafters of our community, I say this as well. When a member of the executive parties complain about the level you as a public sector worker are being paid and say that it's a disgrace, remember this: they set your wages. And time again, they have set it too low. And then whenever they have allowed the collapse of these institutions, it's been the Tories that have set the wages. But we must remember other things. RHI got sorted. SIF got paid. Pet projects got developed and funded. But public sector wages were not. If any of them tell you that your current pay level is too low, remind them it's because they set it too low. Tell them to wipe their crocodile tears from their eyes and demand that pay parity is locked in for the future so that it cannot diverge again. That would be true public sector pay reform. And to take a look very quickly at some of the remarks that there has been in this debate. Blame the Tories. As ever, they blame the Tories even though you take some of the decisions. A remark that it's a job for all the politicians to resolve. It's for the executive to resolve the public pay sector that there is here. To hear that there is some money, but not enough, is not going to be comforting for public sector workers out there. And time again, we heard from speakers that the biggest impact on public sector pay has been the collapse of these institutions, which only two parties brought down. And, of course, there was Mr Frew's contributions, which were typically drab and childish. But for those that fear what is being said, they know they're losing the game when they play the player and not the ball. I thank my colleague Cara Hunter for highlighting that lower pay rips families and workers from the leisure. Mr Speaker, I'm being interrupted here. Sorry, I'm not giving way. So, we also heard from the Minister that people have waited too long for the pay award in 23 and 24, but that situation has been in no small part because of the contribution of parties collapsing the institutions here. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do hope that members will support this motion today and be part of positive change that we want to see in this shared home place. It's time for that change. That time is now. With so many swipes at us as an opposition today, I look forward to seeing everyone in this chamber voting to support public sector pay. Thank you.
I thank the member for that. Members, the question is that the motion standing on the order paper be agreed. All those in favour, say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Members, I suggest take your ease for a change at the top table.